big quote we started off with for the right now was this one. Youth, we are none of us more than 20 years old. But young, youth, that is long ago. We are old folk. And we talked about how this quote says that Paul and his friends, even though they are technically young in years, feel old, and what that means, what we associate with being young, which is energy and hope and big dreams for the future, and what we associate with being old, which is lacking energy and potentially feeling hopeless or isolated or tired, and so that even though they're young, they feel old in some of those ways. And why this matters? We can guess that the war is kind of taking his future away, that it's taking away his youth, which someone commented is the time when you build your life up, and instead of building his own life up, he's going away to the war, and so that Paul's youth and his future are both being stolen by the war. Okay, so let's review some of the parts of chapter 1 to clarify them, because there's a lot that's potentially confusing in this first chapter because it jumps around so much and it dumps us right into the middle of a setting and characters that we don't know yet. So the reading strategies we're focusing on are rereading, visualizing, and asking questions. So please ask yourself questions as we go about what you could clarify. The first section of chapter 1 happens here, and this is the soldiers waiting in line to get their soup from Heinrich. Recall that they have extra food because they have cooked for 150 men, but only 70 men or 80 men have returned back from the battle. So that means they've lost 70 men. An excerpt from this chapter goes like this. Finally, Kaczynski called to him, "Say, Heinrich, open up the soup kitchen. Anyone can see the beans are done." And the cook shakes his head sleepily. "You all must be there first." Jodin grinned. "We are all here." The sergeant cook still took no notice. "That may do for you," he said, "but where are the others?" "They won't be fed by you today. They're either in the dressing station or pushing up daisies," which we discussed means that they are dead under the ground. 80 men can't have what is meant for 150. Okay, so in this passage, one thing I wanted you to notice is how excited the guys are to get extra food. And it feels a little weird that they're so excited to get extra food because that extra food comes at the cost of having lost half of their company. But nobody seems sad or depressed that they've lost so many men. They're just focused on the food. And we talked about why that might be in terms of what you prioritize in war, which is maybe your comforts day by day, what you don't have time to worry about, which is your sadness, the ways that we try to avoid thinking about the things that are difficult by thinking about the things that are easier. And it's much easier to think about extra soup than it is about losing 70 out of your 150 company or 150 man company. That's the first section. The second section of the chapter is here. And this is a confusing section because it's hard to tell what's going on. The guys have boxes that have handles and have seats on the top, and they take them out in a meadow and sit for 2 hours at a time, playing cards and reading letters and talking. What's important here is that those boxes have no bottoms and the seats have holes, so they're kind of like portable toilets where the guys sit out in a meadow at the rest camp with each other and poop for hours at a time. Okay, so we talked about the camaraderie that comes out of being that comfortable with your friends. But then the description of the place is a little weird. Paul says, "We feel ourselves for the time being better off than in any palatial white-tiled, quote, convenience." And he's talking about a bathroom. "There it can only be hygienic. Here it is beautiful. These are wonderfully carefree hours. Over us is the blue sky. On the horizon float the bright yellow sunlit observation balloons and the many little white clouds of the anti-aircraft shells. We hear the muffled rumble of the front only as very distant thunder. Bumblebees droning by quite drown it. We read letters and newspapers and smoke. We take off our caps and lay them down beside us. The wind plays with our hair. It plays with our words and our thoughts." And in this passage, we hear this contrast between the beautiful natural setting he describes with the light breeze and the warm sun and the blue sky and the clouds. But on the horizon, they can see clouds that are formed by anti-aircraft shells, and they can hear the rumble of the front even in the distance. And what initially sounds like a fun balloon or a sunny yellow thing on the horizon is actually an observation balloon, which is designed to see the enemy and shoot him down. So even in this very natural, peaceful setting where the guys are about as relaxed as they ever get, we're presented with the fact that the front is right there and that the war is ever present. And even though the nature is beautiful and kind of tries to overcome it, bumblebees are drowning out the side of the front, it's still present and it never all the way goes away. And that's just a reminder about how immersed and inescapable the war was. The next section of chapter 3 is a flashback, which is confusing. So it's a flashback to before the boys enlisted in the war and kind of a reflection on this guy, who is their teacher, Cantoric. Here's the description of him. It says, during drill time, and again, this is drill time in school, Cantoric gave us long lectures until the whole of our class went, under his shepherding, to the district commandant and volunteered. I can see him now as he used to glare at us through his spectacles and say in a moving voice, "Won't you join up, comrades?" At that time, even one's parents were ready with the word coward. No one had the vaguest idea what we were in for. And so here we hear how the boys ended up joining the war. Remember that Kemmerich and Paul and Kropp and Lear and Mueller all went to school together and joined the war together. And we can see that they were pressured by their teacher, who was clearly older than they were, that it was their duty to their country. So won't you join up, comrades? And that he led them all to the recruitment office to enlist together. And then we also hear that Paul is very aware that even parents were pressuring their sons not to be cowards and to be brave and to enlist in the war. And so here we get a sense of the pressure that young men might have faced at that time as they were trying to decide whether they wanted to go into the war or not. It wasn't really much of a choice. The last scene of chapter 1 takes place here, which is a field hospital. So it's not a fancy hospital, it's kind of built in a tent, makeshift, to treat the people who have been injured at the front. And this is where Paul goes to visit his friend Kemmerich from school with Mueller. Remember that Mueller wants to get Kemmerich's boots because at this point, Kemmerich has had a leg amputated and no longer really needs 2 boots. Mueller thinks he's going to die anyway. And Paul nudges Mueller and says, don't try to take his boots while he's still living. And Mueller says, I don't care, he doesn't need them. And so we see how practical Mueller is and how unemotional he is about taking the things even from a friend who is dying. But Paul's thinking about other things during this scene. This is what he thinks. I think of the time when we went away. Kemmerich's mother, a good plump matron, brought him to the station. So again, we're in flashback to when they first left for the war. She wept continually. Her face was bloated and swollen. Then she caught sight of me and took hold of my arm again and again and implored me to look after Franz out there. Indeed, he did have a face like a child, and such frail bones that after 4 weeks pack-carrying, he already had flat feet. But how can a man look after anyone in the field? Here we see how Paul feels guilty about Kemmerich's death, and also the unfairness and the impossibility of the request that Kemmerich's mom put in. She basically asked Paul to save her son from injury, and her son was a little skinny, potentially weak, timid kid. You can tell there's no way he's going to survive the war without a heavy dose of luck, but still Paul feels very guilty and keeps thinking over and over again about what he's going to tell Kemmerich's mother if Kemmerich dies. And this shows us interesting things about Paul as well, that he's so focused on the well-being of others and his responsibilities and his relationships. Okay, another strategy that will help you enjoy this book and get into it is reading with a purpose, which means looking for themes and big ideas and starting to notice patterns that connect different parts of the book. So there's lots of different potential patterns you might see, but there's 5 we're going to talk about in your groups and revisit over and over again. Here they are. The first theme is called camaraderie, which comes with the French word for comrade. A comrade is a really close friend, somebody who really has your back and who understands you at a really deep level. So camaraderie is a feeling of intense friendship, closeness, or togetherness. The next theme is the loss of innocence. Loss of innocence shows up in tons of literature. It means the leaving behind of innocence that we usually associate with childhood. So when you're a kid, you haven't really done much wrong. You haven't experienced a lot of things in the world that would make you less pure, such as sex or drugs or alcohol, sadness. And you don't know stuff, right? You think things like that Santa Claus is still real, and that's a part of your innocence as well. So the loss of innocence is the leaving behind of all of that, which includes both the innocence of sin or wrongdoing, as well as that naivete, which is the belief that the world is a beautiful, safe, wonderful place losing that belief and knowing that that's not always true is a part of the loss of innocence. And in these pictures, we've got just a reminder about how young some of these soldiers were. On the left, we have young Canadian soldiers at enlistment in World War I, and especially the boy on the right. He must be 14. He looks so young. And then here is actually a soldier from World War II, but it was so powerful I wanted to include it anyway. This is a German soldier from World War II. He's just been captured as a prisoner of war at the Battle of the Bulge. And again, it's a reminder that some of these soldiers were incredibly young. And you can imagine the toll the war takes on such a young person. He's just weeping as he's been caught. The next theme is authority, and it's this question of youth versus the adult world. Who has authority and over whom and why, and is it fair or just, and how far should that authority extend? If you think of Paul as a member of the normal world, the people who would have authority over him are his teachers, his parents. And so that's a question. Should they have authority, and if so, how much? And then once he enters the military, different people have authority over him. People like Hemostas, or the generals, people who command the army. And again, the question is, should they have authority over him? And if so, how much, and how could they use that justly? So this question of authority and whether it's deserved and how it's used is going to come up over and over. The next theme is the horror and glory of war. And war is a weird place because it's full of opportunities for incredible heroism, which is being a hero, patriotism, and humanism, which is treating people well, in the middle of some of the most horrifying experiences possible. So in the middle of a battle, you have incredible opportunities to be a hero, to sacrifice yourself for your country, or to treat people humanely and to pay attention to suffering, even as the world is breaking down around you. And so this theme explores that kind of oxymoron between war being totally horrible and also full of glory. Okay, and then the last theme is my favorite, and it's based on this picture. In this picture we see a British soldier who's wearing the helmet, and he's offering water to a German prisoner who's been captured. So he's a prisoner of war, and the British soldier is giving him water to quench his thirst. And this raises this question that shows up throughout the book. What is the nature of the enemy? What does it mean to call someone your enemy? Can you only call them your enemy if they are entirely different from you? And if you start to realize that you and your enemy have some similarities, does that mean that that person is no longer your enemy? Can they still be your enemy if you have things in common? And Paul's going to return over and over again to this question about who is the enemy, and does that mean that they have to be different from me? So to try applying these themes, I'd like you to think about this quote, which is from chapter 1, and think about which theme you would categorize this quote in. I think you can make legitimate arguments for all 5, so this is a chance for you to test your own thinking. Where do you think it fits? The quote goes like this: "For us lads of 18, teachers and parents ought to have been mediators and guides to the world of maturity, the world of work, of duty, of culture. We trusted them. The idea of authority which they represented was associated in our minds with a greater insight and a more humane wisdom. But the first death we saw shattered this belief. We had to recognize that our generation was more to be trusted than theirs." So think about where you could put that. I think you could definitely put it into authority. You could definitely put it into loss of innocence. I think you could stretch and put it into the nature of the enemy, because here we see that the older generation was almost more their enemy than their opponents were in the war. I think you could definitely put this into the horror and glory of war, right? Which is this idea that you're following orders, which should be glorious and you should be achieving things, but trying to follow orders during war ended up shattering their belief in anything that was important about war. So really you can make a lot of different arguments about where this might fit. Going forward, you will be finding quotes to support a particular theme and sharing those with your group. So make sure that you understand the meaning of the 5 themes that we've talked about and be ready to recognize those in the text going forward.